Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's discussion on budget reconciliation and what you need to know. My name is Josh Feinstone, and I'm a senior legislative analyst here at Venable. I've spent the better part of the last 2 decades working inside and outside of Congress, advocating policies on behalf of senators, members, and clients. Joining me today are 3 of my colleagues from the Venable Government Affairs team. Our bipartisan team provides substantive strategic counsel and impactful representation of your interests before the administration and Congress. Today, my colleagues and I will be discussing the potential for massive spending between now and the end of the year. The amount of money on the table for discussion is anywhere from $2 to $6 trillion. Democrats are working now to move the first package through Congress by way of a budget tool known as reconciliation. They could return to this budget tool again in the summer for an even bigger package involving infrastructure. We will discuss today the process, why it is being used, timeline for action, and how you can engage. To provide additional strategic guidance and outlook, I would like to introduce my colleagues joining the conversation today. Nick Choate is a former Senate and House staffer with over 15 years experience. He was a senior advisor to Senator Claire McCaskill and has extensive relationships with the Senate and House Democrat staffers and the incoming Biden administration. Mike Bloomquist is the former staff director of the Energy and Commerce Committee under former ranking member Greg Walden. Mike's understanding of committee and leadership dynamics provide valuable insight and advocacy to our clients. Last, and certainly not least, it is my pleasure to introduce Chris Scribner. Chris has recently joined Venable and provides our clients primarily with additional expertise with financial services Democrats at the Department of Treasury, the U.S. Senate, and the House of Representatives. Before joining us, he was the head of public policy for a large U.S. bank. He is well respected among Republicans and Democrats, and we are pleased to welcome him into the fold here at Venable. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining me. I would like to quickly note that today's CLE code is Congress 2021. A CLE submission form will be emailed to all registrants sometime next week. As I said, gentlemen, thanks for joining me today to talk about budget reconciliation and what is happening. I'd like to start with Nick Choate. Nick, why is reconciliation in play?
So I guess, go back a month or, maybe more like 6 weeks, and it really boils down to the Georgia Senate runoffs and Democrats winning those 2 races and taking the majority in the Senate. We wouldn't be talking about this if Republicans had held the Senate. But because they have the 50 seats plus the vice president as a tiebreaker and have decided, at least for now, to leave the legislative filibuster in place, really the only way to go big on a COVID relief package, which they and the president are intent on doing with the $1.9 trillion proposal, is to use the reconciliation process. And I know we'll talk more in a little bit about what that is. There has been some bipartisan interest in doing a smaller package. There's some Republican support for up to $600 billion. But Democrats have decided that's not big enough, and they're going to move forward on their own.
So how big is the package that they're doing right now?
So 1.9 trillion is the budget resolution passed last week. It's the target that both chambers have been given, and the expectation is the final reconciliation bill that should be put together here in a couple weeks. We'll hit that figure or pretty close to it.
Now, I want to ask you in a second about some of the focus of the relief bill, but is this the only reconciliation bill that they could potentially do this cycle?
No. So, and again, we'll get into some of the mechanics I know a little later, but, big picture, the Democrats are going to get up to two bites at the reconciliation apple this Congress. Basically, each fiscal year, they can move one reconciliation bill, and Congress didn't do a budget we're in the middle of fiscal year 2021 right now. Congress did not do a budget for fiscal year 2021. So they have a reconciliation package attached to that. And then later this year, we expect they will also use a reconciliation package attached to the FY22 budget. This is very similar to what Republicans did back in 2017 when they had the House, Senate, and White House. They quickly moved as soon as, even before President Trump was inaugurated, with the reconciliation process to repeal the ACA. That bill ultimately failed in the Senate, as folks might remember. They came back later in the year and used the FY18 budget resolution and corresponding reconciliation package to pass the tax bill.
So I want to bring Chris and Mike in here for a second. You're saying 2 reconciliation bills due to 2 budgets that are available to be used. The first is going to be COVID relief. Mike, Chris, and Nick, what do we expect in the first bill, the one that they're working on now? And whoever wants to go first, please go ahead.
Yeah, so happy to take the first crack at that. Where we're at right now is, and not to get too procedural, but last week, both the House and Senate agreed to a budget resolution that gave 12 House committees instructions, reconciliation instructions, to come up with their proposals to meet certain budget numbers. The committees are working on that this week. Most of those bills we've seen at this point. Some of the big ticket items, and a lot of this has been reported in the mainstream press, but $1,400 checks to most American households, significant amount of money to state and local governments, money for vaccines and testing, money for school reopening, number of other things. But like you said, this package is very COVID focused. Back before inauguration, President Biden put out a $1.9 trillion COVID relief proposal. Virtually everything in that was COVID related, except for some money for cybersecurity. The House didn't even put that in their bill. So their $1.9 trillion proposal is very COVID focused.
Gotcha. Mike or Chris, anything to add on what we're going to see in this first bill?
Well, I think
yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to note, sorry, Mike, that what's going to be in the bill is obviously limited to what they can get 50 votes for. And I was, for instance, talking to Senator Sinema Monday night, and she said that she's less focused on the particular number, but does expect and that she would only support legislation closely targeted to pandemic relief, not broadly stimulus, but pandemic relief and focused on 2021 spending. So, individual senators can create constraints on what gets in the bill ultimately.
And
Mike, anything to add?
I'm glad Chris went first. And conversely, in the House, they aren't constrained in the same way the Senate is, because their consideration of the package is governed by a rule where they can waive all points of order. So you'll see a lot more aspirational provisions, such as minimum wage, or creations of other programs ride along in this package in the House, but it's stuff that will be eventually likely to be dropped in the Senate for the reasons that Chris said.
And Mike, I want to get to that because when we're using reconciliation, you talk about process a lot, and the process here matters. This is much different than any other bill that's going to be passed by a 60-vote threshold. Before we get into that, though, I do want to note for those listening, if you have a question, please use the Q&A chat section to pose your question to us. We'll try to get to some of the questions by the end of the program or work them in where they're relevant. And also, as was discussed at the beginning of the hour, the recording and corresponding PowerPoint slides will be available for download on our Venable website later this week. We'll also send you those items via email. So, Mike, going back to you procedurally, can you walk us through, Nick already discussed this is reconciliation. They don't need any Republican votes. Why is that? We know they've passed a budget last week. Can you explain the process here for those who may not know anything about reconciliation or how this tool works?
Sure. Kind of like, as Nick was saying, it's all about the Senate. In the House, the majority can always pass bills with just a 1-vote majority. So as long as you have your team together as a majority, you can move legislation. But in the Senate, normally, you would need 60 votes in order to cut off debate and end a filibuster. But the Budget Act of 1974 created a process called reconciliation, which enabled the Senate to move certain types of bills with a simple majority vote, so 50+1. So that's what the House and Senate are attempting to do here. But what can be considered by reconciliation is limited.
And who's the person that decides what can be considered or not?
So the Budget Act prohibits reconciliation matters from containing what they call extraneous provisions. And in the Senate, this is enforced via a point of order. You'll hear people call this the Byrd Rule because Senator Byrd from West Virginia sought to really keep the reconciliation process from becoming too expansive. Matters are considered extraneous if they don't change spending, basically, or if they're merely incidental. So it could change spending or taxation, but if it's just some wider general policy, they deem that merely incidental to the goals of the provision. And it's the Senate parliamentarian that ultimately decides whether something is subject to a point of order or whether something will survive. Now, occasionally the Senate will all decide we don't care what the parliamentarian says, and they will waive the parliamentarian's ruling that something is extraneous, but that would take 60 votes. So you would need bipartisan support to do that.
I see. So that would be something that is something they all agree on, but by the book, they have to do this. And so they would really rather not do that unless they had to. They'll try to figure out some way to get that across the finish line or without kind of overturning the parliamentarian, but it's certainly something they could do.
Yeah, I would say when that has happened in the past, it hasn't been a political dynamic like today. It's been more the majorities in both parties agree on a certain policy that they're trying to move forward with, and maybe it's just 3 or 4 troublemakers raise a point of order and everybody else rules.
Nick, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, just and Mike pretty much touched on it just now, but just looking back historically, reconciliation hasn't always been this strictly partisan process.
Right.
So you go back to, I think 20 or 21 times since the early 80s has reconciliation been successfully used to enact a law. So not super common. And in those earlier days, those bills sometimes got pretty broad bipartisan support. Certainly in more recent years, the Republican tax bill from 2017, portions of the Affordable Care Act from back in 2009, 2010, those were much more partisan exercises, and that's certainly where we are today. Mike's point about senators being able to override the parliamentarian with 60 votes, they could certainly do that, but given the partisan dynamics right now, I don't expect that to happen.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, so essentially what you're saying is there's a trade-off. You want to do the reconciliation. You can pass policy using this tool, but you're limited. There's things you can do, things you can't do, but really it's a partisan exercise that Republicans and Democrats in recent years have utilized, and this time Democrats are utilizing it essentially at first to do this COVID relief, but also there's going to be another bill. And Chris, I want to bring you in on the second part of this because I think it's what's more important. I think the COVID relief, we have a good sense of what's going with that. We kind of know the timeline. We're actually giving it to all of you, included in our deck here, as to how we see this playing out. But this next use of reconciliation, that's probably going to start sometime second, third quarter. This is a different bill altogether. Can you touch on what you think the second bill might look like and what they're going to be addressing here?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. The second bill in some ways may depend on a few things that get left out of the first, but generally it will be an infrastructure and tax bill that could pay for some of that legislation, but include kind of classic infrastructure, roads and bridges, potentially broadband. We expect it to significantly include climate related goals of the Biden administration, clean energy policies, for instance, and to include some of the tax provisions that Biden ran on in his campaign.
Now let's unwrap that a little bit. What are some of the tax provisions that you could see on the table through a reconciliation bill?
Yeah, during his campaign and what President Biden said he would do on day one of his presidency, and obviously unable to do, would be to raise the corporate tax rate from 21%. The expectation would be to 28%. Other changes to the corporate code might include a guaranteed 15% tax for firms that are larger than $100 million but otherwise show a $0 tax bill. Changes to the individual tax code, particularly for higher income earners. The $400,000 income level has been the number floated to raise the individual rate on ordinary income, Social Security taxes potentially for income over $400,000, increased capital gains taxes for S corps, limiting deductions, pass-through deductions, and then some other taxes on potentially particularly impacting the financial services industry, a financial transaction tax. That's actually a provision that was raised in the an earlier draft of the Republican-led Ways and Means Committee. It's something that presidential candidates ran on. Both Republicans and Democrats have identified it as potentially $80 billion a year, which is $800 billion over 10 years, which could go a long way to paying for an infrastructure bill that could vary from $1.5 trillion to $3 trillion, or even somewhere. It's a very broad range, obviously. So those are other aspects. A gas tax, particularly for traditional infrastructure, a carbon tax. But the bill could also include tax credits for clean energy, so other things that actually reduce the tax burden, which would.
Yeah. Let's bring Mike in. Mike, can you talk a little bit about some of the energy provisions that you could see here that they may want to put forward that you're seeing?
Sure. I mean, we won't know till we know later this year, but as Chris was saying, anything with a tax-related focus is the cleanest and probably the most likely to make it through the Byrd rule process. So that would be tax incentives for electric vehicles, for electric vehicle infrastructure, maybe tax incentives to promote renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal. It could be for battery storage. It could be for general R&D, for carbon capture and sequestration. It could also be spending provisions that plus up existing programs with mandatory spending. So that could open up the door for increased spending on, say, the federal government purchasing renewable power from producers, block grants to states for them to implement renewable or clean electricity standard. It's a lot of it's in how you craft provisions. And I know, for example, there was always a move to try to open up the Arctic refuge, but they couldn't get 60 votes for oil drilling up there. And they worked for years coming up with a provision that would play with the royalty rates and bring in enough revenue through opening the Arctic refuge in Alaska to oil drilling that eventually the Senate parliamentarian thought it had more of a budgetary impact than it had a straight policy impact, and allowed it to ride on reconciliation. So that would be the kind of thing where people are thinking creatively. They're working with advocates and the Legislative Counsel's office to see if there's a way to skin the cat on a lot of provisions so it can ride on reconciliation.
So, Nick, I want to talk about for a second some of the things that they can do in an infrastructure bill that may be outside of reconciliation, but is there anything else that you see that's in the reconciliation bucket here that hasn't been discussed? I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of policy that's just been laid out. That's a lot of changes. That's a lot of revenue raisers right there. Is there anything in addition to that you see in sort of the reconciliation bucket?
Yeah, I think the one big piece, and it's a big variable, but that we haven't touched on is, assuming this package starts coming together and moving like late spring into the summer, I think it's going to depend on where COVID is at as well. Are there additional COVID needs? Do we need to extend unemployment again? Do we need more money for vaccine distribution? And while much of the talk from the administration and Congress on that next package is really focused on, this is a jobs bill, this is about economic recovery, this is infrastructure, we have to acknowledge there might be some additional COVID needs that'll need to be rolled into that.
Yeah, man, that's an excellent point, especially as we saw all through last year in dealing with this, we were constantly thinking about a COVID recovery bill, and we never got to recovery. We were still in relief.
Right.
So that's an excellent point. And here we are again, assuming that that's going to be this big recovery. Well, we got to be ready to recover and not be in the relief mode. That's an excellent point. Let's say that we are in a recovery mode and we are looking at some sort of massive infrastructure bill. So we've got the financing part of this, which will likely be done through reconciliation, but is there a process that exists for a bill that could get 60 votes that could sidecar with this or ride along as kind of a bigger package? How do you see something like that playing out that could win some Republican support? And sorry, one last thing, I know this is a loaded question. What are some of the things that could be included in that? I'd like to start with you, Nick, and then go to Mike and Chris.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the short answer to your first question is, yeah, it's possible. I think the one thing that has kind of been established, and I think this has been fairly widely reported, is the surface transportation bill expires at the end of September, and there is a belief that they won't be able to replenish the highway trust fund through reconciliation. So there is an opening there for at least part of something infrastructure related to move through a standard legislative vehicle with 60 votes. There are any number of scenarios as to what that looks like, right? You could do the lion's share of your revenue raising with some pay-fors and some of your big ticket spending items through a reconciliation package and pass that with Democratic votes, and then come back and, do some additional stuff, probably some spending, probably quite a bit of policy through a standard 60 vote vehicle. That really is going to come down to how cooperative Republicans are and how willing Democrats are to work with Republicans on something like that. But, the joke is, every week seems to be infrastructure week. There is broad bipartisan interest in doing something on infrastructure. I think Chris, I think in a couple points kind of touched on this, but with that second package, I think price tag and focus is going to be an even bigger deal than it is with this COVID package. I mean, by the time we get done with this COVID package, in the course of less than a year, Congress will have spent $5.25 trillion in deficit spending on COVID. I think
in 1 year,
less than 1 year. And I think certainly on the Democratic side of the aisle, there is agreement that spending was needed. But you're going to see some deficit fatigue from even moderate Democrats going into that second package. So like Chris said, using some tax provisions to at least partially pay for that, jobs infrastructure package is going to be a necessity.
Mike, what else do you think could be on the table if they did do an infrastructure bill, either through reconciliation or with some Republican support? I mean, what are we talking about here in terms of projects? You're a client on this webinar. You're somebody who's trying to figure out, okay, a lot of money, but what is it going to? What are some of the things that are being talked about as in play that might perk people up and say, okay, well, I need to get engaged if they're going to be talking about this or that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's all the traditional infrastructure stuff: roads, bridges, airports, harbors, hardening up the shoreline and the floodplains, all the good work of the Corps of Engineers. There's always talk about a green bank happening that would also help facilitate projects in the future. Climate change, whatever can't be done during reconciliation, maybe there's appetite for modernizing the grid or improving transmission generally, whether that's to just make us more resilient to weather and cyber attacks, or if it's to carry more renewable energy. That could all be in the cards. It's, as Nick was saying, it's like if it's a 60 vote package riding along with the reconciliation package, it's going to have to be something that's bipartisan and people like. And then, as Nick was saying, also that's not obvious that they're going to get tricked by the partisan reconciliation package to plus up the funding to, what would be uncomfortable
Mhm.
levels for the Republicans. So it's going
Chris,
to be a dance to see what makes it through.
I think it will be. I think there's a lot on the table. Chris, is there more that you're seeing kind of your world? Mike's kind of energy and commerce, so is Nick. You're a financial services kind of tax guy, but you've seen a lot on kind of the revenue raisers. Do you have any insights on where you think they might go with how they spend some of this money in your world?
Well, the House infrastructure bill that was passed, I guess, late last summer, which started as a traditional kind of infrastructure, roads and bridges bill, ended up getting another $1 trillion of things that included money for housing programs and a range of, what ultimately was kind of sold a little bit as relief, but as stimulus and middle class support. Support for middle class Americans, which would tie into kind of overall Biden administration themes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was just going to underline Nick's earlier point that anything tied to pandemic relief, I think Democrats feel comfortable, deficit financing, and that's to the earlier point about Senator Sinema wanted to keep it narrow. When you get into kind of traditional stimulus for the economy, then there is a much more robust debate, even just among Democrats, about how much needs to be offset by new revenue.
So I want to, in a second, get to process here as to how this bill is going to be drafted, where it's going to go, how that's going to go down. Before we do that, though, we have a couple questions on parliamentary procedure and a tax question here. So I want to get this to the group. First question is, can the Senate parliamentarians' decision that a point of order doesn't apply and a measure is eligible for reconciliation be overruled by a vote, simple majority or 60 of the Senate?
So I think the short answer there is that the way to go about that is, if I understand the question correctly, so a provision has survived the so-called bird bath and is in the reconciliation bill when it hits the Senate floor. The way to get it out is by filing an amendment to strike it. And then that is the way the Senate can vote to effectively override that behind the scenes decision of the parliamentarian.
And this might be a question for Chris, can Congress change Social Security taxes through budget reconciliation?
Yes, I believe they can.
I'm actually going to chime in there and disagree with Chris.
Okay.
Social Security is actually exempt from the reconciliation process. You can't touch Social Security.
But what about, Chris, the 2017 tax cuts? Could you go back and reverse some of that stuff through reconciliation?
Yes, and I think the interesting point on that is that even just through Treasury Secretary Yellen's testimony to Senate Finance Committee, there are a lot of 2017 tax bill provisions that Democrats are going to want to support, but in terms of raising the rates on upper income, ordinary income, and others, yes, that could be addressed.
Okay. Last question I'm going to talk about here from kind of what I'm seeing is, do we believe that the defense budget will be reduced, remain the same, or grow as part of reconciliation? In other words, do you think that they'll try to funnel more money to defense? We've seen more money go to defense for COVID relief, but that's targeted things for the military. That's not necessarily, buying more tanks and guns. But could they, in theory, reduce 302A budget levels or anything along those lines through reconciliation if they wanted to?
Well, that's mostly discretionary spending, so I don't think that would be subject to reconciliation. I mean, they could raise it. I guess they could do mandatory programs, but I don't think they'd cut it.
I know I said one more question, but I actually saw a good one here. Is there a likelihood that the SALT deduction will be reinstated through reconciliation this year? I mean, I know it's an issue. I know it's something that Schumer has put on the top of his list. Do you think that they'll try to address that through reconciliation?
So I'll just speculate on this. There is certainly a lot of interest from Democrats from certain states in doing that.
Mm-hmm. New York, California.
Yep, Northeast and California. do you have Joe Manchin? Do you have Kirsten Sinema?
Right.
I don't know.
Right, and that's really the takeaway here when we're talking about using reconciliation. You lose one in the Senate, you've got big problems. You've got a 3-seat cushion in the House, you lose a few, you've got big problems. So that's kind of what I think as you're looking at this and they're coming forward with the bill, that's the challenge for the Biden administration and congressional leaders. How do we see the next bill coming together? Is this something that is going to be written by the administration and sent to the House and the Senate, and they're just going to have to swallow it as is? Is there going to be a back and forth? What is the process here? And I bring that up because if you're sitting here and you're listening to this conversation, you've picked up that there's going to be a couple bills. There's going to be a lot of money. A lot of taxes are on the table. A lot of programs are being initiated. And this might be stuff that my company plays in. And what should I do and how should I be involved? And understanding who the main actors are is going to be helpful to understanding how I should position. So I'm curious if you guys can address how this may develop. How's the sausage going to get made here?
So I think stepping back for a second, you have to look at the process for the current bill, in part because they wanted to move quickly, just days into the new Congress and the new administration. And in part because the impeachment trial in the Senate going on right now, we didn't see even a typical reconciliation process play out. Yes, House committees are marking up, but we're hearing frustration from even senior Democrats that they had very little input into these bills. This was all pre-cooked. We don't expect the Senate to do markups at all. So I think given that frustration and the fact that we probably have a little more time on the second package, you're likely going to see a more traditional process where the committees at least go through the motions. Members probably have an opportunity to have a little more input into these bills. There isn't the urgency to get this done by 8 weeks into the new administration.
Right.
Mike,
Right.
Chris, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
I think that's exactly right. I think, the way to do it is to look at the budget resolution, see what the instructions or spending targets are for the respective committees. And then say in this latest round, Energy and Commerce had $188 billion spending target. They're allowed to look at anything within their jurisdiction to hit that number. And so Medicare, Medicaid, so they could do, prescription drug pricing, they can do spending, they can do offsets, they can do anything in their jurisdiction. So if you have a project and it's reconcilable and you have a committee that is given instructions, then they can potentially take up your priority.
Chris, did you want to add anything here on that?
I think what I would add is, just given the time frame that, Nick and Mike have laid out, the idea of a 100-day measurement isn't the best measurement for the Biden administration. Of course, they are going to be interested in their priorities, but they are going to work through this process that, Mike and Nick just described.
But that with that, unlike COVID, where they need to get some stuff done right now, and you may not love everything that's in that bill, but there's a greater good that they're working towards. With the second bill, you're probably going to have a minute to have some robust discussion as to the nuances of exactly what you want to do and how you want to do it, which means for our clients, there's an opportunity to go in and advocate for a position one way or another. And it's probably going to be more traditional than not, in the sense that go to the committees of authorization, talk to leadership, talk to the administration. If you know that an issue that you kind of touch is on the table, you need to lean in a little bit. Otherwise, they may not fully understand the perspective that you're bringing to the table. Is that a correct stance? Is that a correct assumption that there is an opportunity here to engage and advocate that probably wasn't as wide open in this COVID package?
I think that's right. The other thing I would add is, and again, this is speculation, but I think everybody needs to leave, all the doors open. And while we fully expect a reconciliation package to move, another reconciliation package to move, like we talked about earlier, there could also be a traditional legislative vehicle. So even if your priority isn't dollars and cents or a tax provision that would clearly fit into reconciliation, I don't think that means you should just stand down on your policy changes. I can't, again, we can't say with any certainty, they have not shown their cards on this, but it is certainly reasonable to suspect that, there could be an opportunity to move along with a reconciliation package in a traditional legislative vehicle.
So, want to go back. We've had a lot of questions in the meantime that's talking about process. And so, Mike, you're kind of our parliamentarian guy today, but anyone can answer this question. Can we get into a little bit more detail on what's extraneous under that Byrd rule? So you've outlined in the deck here a list of things that might be in the House bill that probably won't survive what's known as a Byrd bath in the Senate, where the parliamentarian basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, will look at the overall package that's sitting in front of them and dump out all the things that they can't do. Is that basically what the Byrd bath is?
Correct. And there are reasons why the Democrats in the House want it in there. They're very narrow majorities. They want to look like they're fighting as much as possible for policies that are important to the base. Also, as Nick was saying in another call we were on, it's a signal to the administration about what the House's priorities on spending are. Here's what we should be spending money on. But the precedents are there, or it's just flat out not allowed under the Budget Act. But so minimum wage increase, unlikely. DC statehood, unlikely. Gun reform measures, unlikely. Social Security, can't do it. Conservation programs, all that kind of stuff is not likely to make it through the Senate parliamentarians' review.
Yeah, and there's a question almost of expectation setting for perhaps some camps that are very excited that there's all Democrat rule. They're going to see this bill come out from the House, and then they're going to see what the Senate can actually do. Is there a concern that there's a backlash on disappointment, or do the senators know that they've got to stick together here? And for everything that Manchin might want on this end, there's some very progressive senators that are going to hold firm to some things that they want to see as well. Maybe that is, somehow doing minimum wage. I don't know. Anyone want to touch on kind of that dynamic on what could tip the apple cart?
Yes, I think minimum wage is probably the biggest progressive prize out there that is in the House bill, and conventional wisdom is probably won't survive the Senate. And I think Mike did a good job of describing the Byrd rule and kind of the criteria there. But I think the trickiest piece of the Byrd rule, and this is what makes it so subjective and the Senate parliamentarians, eventual decision so unknowable until they decide, is the fact that something costs the federal government money or saves the federal government money isn't by itself enough to get in. I think CBO scored the $15 minimum wage at a 50, I don't have it in front of me, but I want to say it was 58 billion over 10 years. So that's real money. But if the parliamentarian decides that cost is just incidental to the broader policy goal, it gets Byrd ruled out of the bill. Mm-hmm. I think I don't want to overgeneralize, but it seems most people agree that is probably what will happen with the minimum wage provision. There are certainly those arguing, Senate Budget Committee Chairman Bernie Sanders being one of them, that, absolutely the minimum wage meets the test and should be included in the reconciliation package. Do I think you're going to lose Bernie Sanders or other liberals in the caucus if minimum wage is not in there? No, this is too important. Yeah. They're not going to blow up a $2 trillion COVID package over that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. One of the other questions that was brought up multiple times, two questions. One, is the estate tax engaged here at all? Is there any game on that, likelihood of modifying it, anything along those lines? Anyone hearing anything about estate tax?
It's had less discussion, recently in terms of, Biden's tax priorities, but I will note that Secretary Yellen defended kind of a rollback of, or a return to the pre-2017 estate tax in her testimony and her answers to senators' questions and follow-up questions. It was a significant part of Biden's campaign tax plan. So I think that is in play. Anything, again, that doesn't impact that below $400,000 of income that's in the 2017 bill is probably not going to be touched, but other provisions, are in play.
So I'm being asked to say that the CLE is budget reconciliation for those who've been patiently waiting for that. I want to quickly talk about the politics of this. So in a reconciliation package, you don't need any Republicans. However, you are talking about anywhere from $2 to $6 trillion that's going to be spent. Over the last 4 years, Republicans have raised zero concerns on debts and deficits, at least I've seen in campaigns or anything along those lines. However, it seems all of a sudden debts and deficits are of concern again in the Republican Party. How is that going to play in this discussion? Are the Democrats just going to sort of move along and not really worry about that, knowing that that may be a campaign issue later? How concerning is it beyond politics about the debt and the deficits, if at all, for COVID or infrastructure? Are they just going to say this is more important than that, or is there going to be somebody like a Senator Manchin who might say this is a lot of money?
I'll take the sort of a two-part question as I understood it, and you kind of asked the non-political, political, and then the non-political question at the end.
I did. Sorry.
But I will say from the policy sense, there is a huge debate among Democrats about whether or not how much an economist how much the deficit matters and whether or not that should be ignored and how much the federal government can spend without raising revenue. And so that is a significant debate that exists. You also see the kind of where people fall depends on how tough their reelection is, what kind of state do they represent, do they need to be kind of a conservative to moderate on economics issues, Democrat, and that impacts people like Manchin, Senator Sinema, Mark Kelly, who was just elected from Arizona up in 2022.
Perhaps Warnock.
Raphael Warnock in Georgia. So there are others who will look at that also through a political lens, where voters do look at those issues, but they may look at that issue more through a $15 minimum wage or something that seems more real to them than the actual size of.
Well, and look, to be clear, there's a dynamic here that's unfolding where the Democrats are using reconciliation to COVID relief and for a lot of money going out through infrastructure and maybe even minimum wage. Republicans used reconciliation for massive tax cuts, which also had benefits to the economy, but two different messages, right? Two very different messages.
Yeah, and I think how that is messaged is critically important, as you said. I mean, I would note in the pandemic relief passed last year, the tax cuts essentially that were part of for deductions for net operating losses. The 10-year projections for those are larger than the revenue that would be raising the rate on ordinary income for people earning more than $400,000. So there are a variety of ways, obviously how these things are messaged, what they're tied to, are critical, often more important than the somewhat abstract numbers.
Well, listen, we're wrapping up here. I have one last question for all of you. You all have clients. You are all working hard to impact the reconciliation bills on behalf of certain issues that you have. Mike, Nick, Chris, in that order, what would you do right now if you were a client and you're trying to figure out what are you going to do to make sure X issue is addressed how you need it to be addressed as Congress looks to spend $2 to $6 trillion? Mike, what would you do?
I'd get in early and start educating people early, make them familiar with your issues, and then, as Nick says, it'll become apparent down the road kind of which package it possibly belongs into, or maybe there's something else like the end of the year NDAA bill or other opportunities as Congress kind of cleans things up. But it's not waiting is always the hardest thing. The hardest thing is to show up with a new idea that hasn't been properly introduced in a when things aren't crazy.
Nick?
Yeah, I agree with Mike. On these last couple of COVID packages, Congress has largely been pulling ideas off of the shelf or just replenishing programs they already created in the earlier bills. But I think going forward with this possible next bill, the infrastructure tax jobs bill, they're going to be more open to new ideas than they probably have been, I would say, in like the last 6 months.
Chris?
I just put a fine point on those two remarks and just say find members who can support and champion those ideas. Finding particular members to try to move those is critically important as kind of the second step of that education process.
Well, I think we'll stop there. I think that's excellent advice. I want to thank Mike, Nick, and Chris for joining me today on this webinar. This issue is complicated, and there's a lot of steps to this, but it's important, it's impactful, and there's going to be a lot going on between now and probably the end of the year. So thank you for joining today's discussion. I hope that everybody at home benefited from your expertise. I know that it was very helpful to have this conversation. This concludes our webinar on the reconciliation process. Thank you today for joining our discussion. A recording of this session will be available shortly on our website. The members of this panel will be responding and getting back to those that ask questions that we did not get to during the presentation in the coming days. We also invite you to visit venable.com to contact our legislative and government affair professionals. That's us on the screen, plus a whole bunch of other really smart people. If you have any additional questions or comments, go there. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I will say goodbye for today, and we will see you soon.